amphibians. And the word itself, amphibian, the end of it comes from like bios. Bio means what? Biology is the study of life, living things. Amphibian comes from the words ampha and bios, Greek, meaning double life or living in both ways. And it has to do with their ability to often live in water and on land, and to require water for reproduction. We can kind of think about amphibians and split them into some categories. They're not really taxonomic categories, but when we talk about amphibians, we generally separate into one group of amphibians which has smooth skin, generally moist, with long hind legs. What group is that? What type of amphibian? Frogs. Amphibians with a similar body shape but with dry, bumpy skin, and generally shorter hind legs. Go on. Those are toads. Although really frogs and toads are in the same taxonomic group. There's not a distinction, but we talk about them separately. If you pick up a toad, does that give you warts? No. Warts are caused by what? Do you know? A virus. Not by an amphibian. Jane? Oh, your question? No? All right. And how about the third group?
Snakes. Oh wait, no, snakes are
Salamanders.
Common mistake though, Donovan. What?
Salamanders.
Salamanders and newts.
Asian invasion.
What's the difference between a salamander and a
There's not a real distinction. They're similar, both four-legged, sort of shaped like what other organism? People often will confuse salamanders with
lizards?
lizards. Not the same. Lizards are
Reptiles.
reptiles. Salamanders are amphibians.
Amphibians.
So, amphibians come in a variety of shapes, sizes, colors. The smallest vertebrate is actually an amphibian. It's a frog from New Guinea that is less than 1 centimeter in length. They're tiny, tiny little organisms. Okay? No. So this is, this is a poison dart frog. Again, bright colors are adaptation to do what?
Blend in.
No. Bright colors. Antonio, what? Advertising the dangerous nature of the organism so that predators do not eat them. It's not useful to be poisonous if you kill your predator after you've been eaten. Right? It is most advantageous for an organism to warn a predator before it eats it that it is poisonous. And that's why often poisonous animals are brightly colored. Toad and salamander. All right, let's talk about some of the details. Body temperature. Amphibians are what? Cold-blooded, ectothermic. And what did we talk about yesterday? What is the advantage to being ectothermic or cold-blooded?
Less energy.
Less energy requirements, yes. They require much less energy than warm-blooded animals. Many amphibians go through a process of metamorphosis, and frogs are probably the most common example you talk about. And you know, frogs hatch from
Eggs.
eggs, as do all amphibians. Okay? And they go through a change in body structure. So frogs start off as eggs that are almost always laid in the water. That's where they go. They're also fertilized in the water. So they have, what do we call that? well, we call it spawning in fish. We don't usually call it spawning in amphibian, but external fertilization. The female frog releases eggs into the water. The male frog releases sperm into the water. Sperm cells fertilize the egg cells. They can then start to grow. Frogs do not release as many eggs as fish, probably in the hundreds, not thousands of eggs usually. Once those eggs are fertilized, they grow and eventually hatch into tadpoles.
Baby bro.
Tadpoles have gills generally that they use for obtaining oxygen from the water. They have tails. They don't have any legs to begin with. How many people catch tadpoles in a pond or something? Did you keep them?
Yep.
Did they develop into frogs?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, sometimes they do. Sometimes they may get in your pool or something. Generally, it's not a great place for them to survive because of chlorine and other chemicals. But sometimes they do lay eggs in pools. So, if you ever observe tadpoles growing and developing, what are the changes that happen? Donovan?
They get little legs.
They start to grow legs. What else?
Their tail gets smaller.
Their tail gets smaller and smaller.
They lose their gills.
They lose their gills. They change into
Frogs.
They lose their gills and then they develop
Frogs.
lungs for obtaining oxygen. Okay. So legs start to form. Eventually you have a tiny little froglet, which eventually makes its way into land as an adult frog.
Froglet.
With these legs?
No, the tadpole.
No, this tadpole's still in the water. But it's sort of a gradual
No,
shift.
it'd be funny to see them like waddling
Yeah.
around.
Would be fun. So that's the process of metamorphosis, this change in the body structure. If we compare back to fish, how many chambers in a fish's heart? Two. An atrium where blood enters, a ventricle that pumps blood out. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart. Amphibians have 2 atria and 1 ventricle.
Isn't that what humans have?
Excuse me?
Is that what humans have?
Nope. What do humans have?
4.
4-chambered heart, 2 atria, 2 ventricles. So if we look at the chambers in a frog's heart, these top chambers are the atria. So the right atrium and the left atrium. And then on the, below them, you have the ventricle. Now there's an advantage to this, and an even greater advantage to a 4-chambered heart. And the advantage is that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood can be kept separate. In a 4-chambered heart, they're kept completely separate. There's never any mixing of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. In a 3-chambered heart, in a 2-chambered heart, there's lots of mixing. In the 3-chambered heart, there's less. In a 4-chambered heart, there's almost none, or there is none. So what happens is deoxygenated blood, blood that has given up its oxygen to the cells of the body, comes into the right atrium of the heart. Then goes into the ventricle, and the ventricle pumps blood out. Some of this blood will go to the lungs, and some will go to other body parts. Okay? And so that blood is kept sort of separate. There is some mixing in this area. As the deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood get pumped down to this ventricle, there's some mixing, but it's kept more separate than in just a 2-chambered heart. Okay? And this is an important adaptation. Now, why are these labeled incorrectly? Why does this say right atrium?
Because we're looking at the wrong side.
Yeah, you label organs in an animal as if they were in the organism. So if that was in my body, if I were a frog, and that was my heart, that's my right side. That's my right atrium on this side, and my left atrium on this side. So when you look at it though on the paper, it's reversed. So amphibians obtain oxygen in a few different ways. First off, many amphibians can obtain oxygen through their skin. Amphibians have very thin skin, so it's unlike a fish with these thick protective scales. Amphibians have very thin skin, and underneath, and when we dissect frogs in a few weeks, you'll look at the underneath of the skin and you'll see all of these blood vessels in there. Okay? It's filled with blood vessels so that it can absorb some oxygen from the air. Some amphibians, actually, some salamanders have no lungs whatsoever. All of their oxygen they obtain through their skin. And they can do this throughout their lifetimes. And the amphibians have gills. Now, often they're only present in the tadpole stage. They're adapted to getting oxygen out of the water. And as they reach adulthood, they develop lungs, which are adapted for getting oxygen out of the air. So multiple ways of obtaining oxygen. Okay, a couple more facts about amphibians. Many amphibians do hibernate. Right? And hibernation is an adaptation that lots of different organisms have. Okay? It allows them to survive in conditions in which there's not very much food available. Conditions are cold, inhospitable. So right now, amphibians in our area are still alive, okay, but they're generally hibernating in burrows in the mud, in ponds and things like that, rivers, lakes. And so, because there's very little food available for amphibians right now, because it's so cold and because they're cold-blooded, they're very inactive. Okay, they can't really do very much. Okay, so they hibernate. So they're cold-blooded organisms, so they need very little energy to survive. When they're hibernating, they need even less. Their heart rate slows down to almost stopping. Their respiration rate stops. They just absorb oxygen through their skin. But they still need some energy to stay alive. You can't survive without any energy. And so they get that energy by an organ called fat bodies. All organisms have ways of storing energy. Now, mammals store energy in body fat beneath the skin. Any excess calories that aren't used are stored as fat. And then if there's ever a time when that animal doesn't have enough energy, you can get that energy out of those reserves. Amphibians have something, it's not quite the same, but it's similar. They're called fat bodies. And if you look inside of a frog, like we will, these yellowish things, they look kind of like bananas. Inside the body cavity of the frog, those are the fat bodies. Those waxy sort of yellowish orange things. And when you look in a frog, when you do your frog dissection, you can tell. When you open up, if there's a lot of fat bodies, what does that probably mean about that frog? Laura?
It means it doesn't have a lot of food that gets in, so they need to store it.
Yeah, so if there's a lot, when you open up and there's a lot of fat bodies, what does it probably mean about the frog's life previous to its death?
It ate a lot.
They had a lot of food, a lot of energy to build up those fat bodies, okay? Or it was about to hibernate. If you find very few fat bodies, maybe it was at the end or it just come out of hibernation and had used up lots of that energy. Or maybe it didn't have adequate food supply to build up many fat bodies.
Can we dissect them if we do something wrong with blood, like the one?
No, they have no blood in them. I mean, frogs generally have blood, but they don't have blood when we get them. Type stuff. It's removed, and they are sometimes, I don't know which frogs are injected or not. You can buy frogs injected so that all of the arteries are filled with red latex and all of the veins are filled with blue latex, so you can sort of tell the differences when you're looking at them. Okay, reproduction. Frogs, amphibians, in general, have external fertilization. Males release sperm into the water. Females release eggs into the water. Generally happens in the springtime, like most animals. Why do most animals reproduce in the springtime? Yeah, because there's more food available, more food about to become available as temperatures warm up, as late spring and summer come. Gives those young that are newly born time to grow, develop before the next winter. And generally, amphibians will lay hundreds of eggs, not thousands, tens of thousands like fish. Has anyone ever seen frog eggs? You might find like in a, where'd you see them? In a camp, like in the lake or something. What are they like?
They're all like stuck together.
All stuck together in like this jelly-like substance. So they're all this sort of goo that keeps them together, allowing them to be more likely to be fertilized. Okay? So here you see a whole mass of frog eggs. Each little black thing is one of the frog embryos growing inside of an egg, but they're sort of held together in this jelly-like mass. Any questions about those amphibians? All right. Let's talk reptiles next. Yeah, I know. All right, reptiles. So amphibians evolved from what? Fish. Okay. Some fish adapted to be able to spend more and more time on land, okay, by using their gills in a way that allowed them to obtain oxygen from the air as well as the water. There are still fish today, like a lungfish, a mud skipper, that can come out of the water, that can still obtain oxygen from the air. Like a mud skipper will travel from pond to pond over the land. It's still a fish, has all the characteristics of fish, but it's able to exist outside of the water for a longer period of time.
How does it move?
So it uses its fins to sort of walk across the mud. So yeah, amphibians evolved from fish. Okay, eventually groups of amphibians split off and evolved into reptiles. And reptiles so one of the unique things about reptiles is they don't require the water for reproduction. Reptiles can live in dry land for all of their lives. There's a couple important adaptations that made that possible. First off is their body covering. As I said, amphibians have very thin skin, which means if they're out in the hot sun, what can happen to them?
It can die.
Yeah, they can dehydrate very easily because of that thin skin. Reptiles, however, have
Thick skin.
not quite skin,
Scales.
scales. They have thick, waterproof scales that keep their moisture inside of their body, preventing them from drying out. Now, people think like a snake is slimy, but probably most of you have touched a snake before, I would guess. They're not slimy, they're dry.
Looks funny.
So you can see on this iguana, you can see the scales that cover its body. There's a turtle, snapping turtle. Now, another important adaptation that made life on land possible is internal fertilization. Okay. In order for eggs to become fertilized, okay, they have to be in sort of a moist, wet environment for sperm cells to swim and reach the egg cells. So on dry land, that's a problem. So reptiles evolved to have internal fertilization. So fish, the female lays eggs outside of the water, and same thing amphibians. Female lays eggs in the water, male releases sperm in the water, they mix, some of those eggs get fertilized. Well, reptiles living on dry land, that's not possible. So they adapted to have internal fertilization, where males actually deposit sperm inside of the female's body. And fertilization takes place inside of the body, which obviously is different from amphibians or fish. Then what happens? After those eggs are fertilized inside the female's body, in reptiles, what happens? Those eggs.
She then lays the egg.
Yeah, then she generally lays the egg. And then development of the embryo happens where? In the egg, outside of the body. So they have internal fertilization, but external development. Their shells are sort of leathery. Has anyone ever touched turtle eggs or snake eggs? The shells. It's not hard like a chicken egg that you get at the grocery store. They're sort of this tough, leathery shell, more flexible. And it's waterproof. So inside of that waterproof egg is sort of a moist, watery environment for that embryo to grow. Okay, there's nutrients in the egg to support the embryo as it's growing. So that's a unique adaptation. Again, as always, there's some exceptions to this. Some eggs, some snakes, the eggs fertilize inside of the female, but then the egg stays in the female. And then the egg hatches inside the female and live young come out of the female. So there are some exceptions to these. And generally those eggs are laid on land. And they only produce, a few eggs at a time. Reptiles, how about their body temperature? Cold-blooded. Ectothermic. Body temperature fluctuates. And you may have witnessed this if you go to Florida or something. In the morning, after a cool night, the sun comes out. You ever see those little anoles, those little small lizards? What do? They sun themselves. They may be on like a screen door, laying the sun on a rock on the sidewalk. What they do is they go into the sun to try to warm their bodies back up so they can become active again. So they can't do it internally, but they have behaviors that help them to do that. On a very hot day in the middle of the day, what do these reptiles do? Go under a rock, in the shade, in the water. They'll move somewhere so their body temperature doesn't get too elevated. So they have these behaviors that help regulate their body temperature, even though they don't do it internally. Right?
When I was in Florida, I saw those tiny lizards everywhere. They're all in the soil on the ground.
Yeah, they're very common. Simon?
What happens if their body temperature does get too high?
Then they can die.
Heat strokes.
And they can die.
That was just.
All right. As far as circulation, reptiles have one step closer to a 4-chambered heart. They have what we call 3.5-chambered heart. So it's not quite 4, but almost. If we look here at this heart, we have a right atrium, a right ventricle, right atrium, left atrium. The ventricle here on the bottom has